Okay, hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about wrapping up World War I and the impact that it has on the United States. So without further ado, if you are one of my students or if you use American Yelp as your textbook, here are the page numbers and here are the key terms that we'll cover today. And here are the questions that we seek to answer. So we're going to look at the impact of the 1918 influenza outbreak. We'll also look at just general post-war negotiations, how there's this attempt to establish a long-lasting peace. And then lastly, how the First World War impacts thoughts on race in the United States. And starting with the flu. So it actually still to this day is often referred to as the Spanish flu of 1918, but it's very rarely discussed why that was. The flu did not originate in Spain, but rather Spain was a neutral power in World War I, and so it was openly publishing stories about flu casualties. Nations directly involved in the war, like the US, feared that news of a deadly pandemic was going to hurt wartime morale, and so they were less transparent about infection and death rates through the media. Now, the first strain discovered was in a military training camp in Kansas, and the virus spread rapidly in and around the camp and subsequently abroad because soldiers were deployed from that camp and various other military training bases all over Europe to the front lines. Outbreaks were reported in 14 other American military training camps between March and May of 1918 alone, and the virus ultimately mutated, much like we've seen in COVID-19 over the past 2 years, and a second, much deadlier strain disproportionately killed younger Americans in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and that had a profound impact on the economy as well, given that demographic was both in the middle or early stages of their career, and also they were of childbearing age. And while 1918 to 1919 was the deadliest period for this flu, it continued to spread into the early 1920s, and there was no actual cure found. It was more difficult to treat this flu than some subsequent pandemics, including COVID-19, because there were limits in medical treatment and research. So there was never a vaccine developed for this particular flu, and modern approaches such as antibody treatments also were unavailable for this flu. So by the time this flu was no longer an issue, an estimated 50 million people worldwide had died from it between 1918 and 1919. And by comparison, about 8 million soldiers died in World War I. So the casualty from the flu was far, far greater. And you can only imagine the impact that it had on economies and just generally the state of all countries and all people affected directly. Okay, ending the war itself. So just generally, it's important for us to just know that all the powers involved directly in the war were seeking a swift peace treaty, and the Allied powers, so the United States, Britain, and France, Russia and Germany actually signed a separate peace because the Bolshevik Revolution was breaking out. I can touch upon that briefly or just drop a link to another video that will go into much more detail. But just know this, the Allied powers that were still involved, they wanted not only a swift peace treaty, but they wanted an aggressive one. They wanted to solely blame Germany for this war. The Treaty of Versailles was the peace treaty that was eventually ratified by 1919. And it's interesting because even though the United States played a major role in shaping the provisions on that treaty, they never actually signed it. They never ratified it. President Wilson played a predominant role in the peacekeeping process by articulating his goals before the war even ended for a post-war world. The goals were called the 14 points, and I won't summarize all of them to you now, but just generally, one of the primary goals of the 14 points was to establish self-determination, another way of saying self-rule, self-governance, the ability to control the future of a nation state. He also wanted freedom of the seas. He wanted to end secret treaties between nations. He wanted free trade. All of this is really connected to freedom of the seas, by the way. And he also wanted to have some sort of post-war collective security agreement between nations to prevent any type of war like this from ever breaking out again. And that was to become the League of Nations. And it's important just to know again that the United States not only never ratifies the Treaty of Versailles, but they also never join the League of Nations. And that was largely because Congress itself blocked of the U.S. joining the League of Nations. This was a Republican-led effort against the president, Wilson, who was a Democrat. So some of this was quite political, but in general, it all fell down to the difference in viewpoints as to whether or not the United States should involve itself in worldwide affairs or whether the United States should remain neutral. And we'll talk about that much more when we get into World War II. Okay, so again, you can probably tell that even though the war was over, things like the actual arrangement of a post-war world, redrawing maps, dealing with a massive global pandemic, these problems were far from over. So I want to actually start from the bottom of this slide and just again point out that in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution was taking place, and that toppled a dynastic system that had lasted for about 1,000 years in Russia. And this impact is felt acutely in the United States in the form of a Red Scare, this fear that the communist way of thinking in both the United States and in other parts of Europe would make its way into the United States. So this does shape immigration policy. It does manifest itself in many new nativist sentiments throughout the country. We'll talk about this more when we cover the 1920s, so stay tuned for that. It's also important for us to just note that Wilson's goal of self-determination was not applied equally all over the world. And so there was often this attempt to establish quasi-autonomy in regions by establishing what were called mandates. These were non-Western, non-capitalist, typically non-white nations that were carved out, and they were called mandates because a certain European country was in control of them. And I'll show you a few examples in just a second here. So the alleged goal of these mandates, in fact, how about I show this to you now? It will be easier. I'm going to come back to that. So here we are in the Middle East, and I'll point out a couple of examples here and also drop some links to other videos that will go into these topics in much more detail. But again, the alleged goal of these mandates was to assist these nations towards independence, but in reality, they were controlled more like colonies. So you saw superpowers like Great Britain being unwilling to let go of the fortunes that they were making by controlling so much territory. In fact, Africa is a much more telling example because you see that the only change on this map from before World War I was that the former German colonies become these international mandates. And other than that, the map of Africa that resulted from that imperialist scramble for Africa remains the same. Now back to the Middle East, you see that this was the remains of the Ottoman Empire, which officially collapsed by the end of World War I. And what happens is you see that these areas that become modern day nation states at first were established as mandates. And you can see in the map key which country actually controlled them. And it's important also to note the implications that this has on the Arab-Israeli conflict, because Palestine was a British mandate, and it was, to say the least, not managed particularly well, and that's going to result in massive infighting between Palestinians living in the region and also Jewish people living in the region. And eventually that will lead to the independence of the State of Israel and many, many, many other issues that are not possible to get into in this video because it would just take way too long. Okay, so going back to Europe, I think it's helpful to realize that this is a better example of self-determination in the sense that you do see some major redrawing of the map here. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, when it collapses, you see these new nation states that are carved out, largely around some sort of common language group or ethnicity, although it is not nearly as simple. You actually do see frequently that there are borders of certain new nations that sort of do not accurately comprise the demographic makeup of the state. The same thing can definitely be said in the Middle East. So I think of certain stateless people like the Kurds, for example, that were not considered when these new maps were drawn. But nonetheless, when you're looking at Europe, you do see the precursor to some nation states that still exist to this day, but then others that have since fallen apart. And actually, in some circumstances, like what you see in what used to be Yugoslavia, you see that the present day map actually is largely reminiscent of what it looked like prior to World War I. So that's interesting to note. So to a certain extent, what they're trying to do when they're redrawing this post-war map is to establish some sort of self-determination, right? The idea for for former members of a large empire to carve out their own nation where they can govern themselves, speak a common language, etc. But it's not perfect, particularly when outside powers are the ones drawing the lines. And when you are a minority living in one of those regions, and I should also, of course, mention if you are a religious minority living in these regions, specifically if you are Jewish, this is also a very, very difficult system to exist in, and that will help you understand the necessity of having a Jewish nation state in what was at that point Palestine. Again, lots more detail that I don't have time to get into here, but very, very interesting stuff. Asia as well. You do not really see any type of self-determination here. You really see the continuation of the status quo. So last thing that I just want to get into briefly, finishing up this video, is what the First World War does to race relations in the United States. So we've already talked about racial tension, of course, leading into this period. We know that when Reconstruction collapsed in 1877, that the vehement escalation of Jim Crow laws in the South, but then also, of course, de facto segregation all over the entire country is a major problem. Remember from previous discussions of World War I that there was a draft, and this draft, there was no ability to buy your way out of it. So what you see is as the war comes to a close, this racial tension really ramps up, largely due to competition for jobs as veterans return, but also from the perspective of Black soldiers, just the general sense of disillusionment, fighting abroad on the front lines for democracy, and then returning home to a nation that did not treat them as full-fledged citizens. And so what you saw was during the war, there was a massive migration, the Great Migration. We'll discuss this more when we get into the 20s, of Black families escaping Jim Crow. Many of them moved to the north, to the northwest, to the Midwest rather, to the west, and sought opportunities in new cities where wartime production jobs were abundant. And violence broke out in many cities, both during and towards the end of the war. Part of this was because oftentimes this competition for jobs, in this sense, from some in the white community, that Black workers were taking their jobs, there often would be white-led state militias that would actually confront head-on Black veterans, right? So you see this happen in both of these pictures. There were several race riots in many major cities in the United States. The most violence we saw in the city of Chicago, and riots oftentimes ensued by white supremacist groups, caused hundreds of deaths and millions of dollars in property damage. Again, the heat of the violence was indeed in the summer of 1920 in the city of Chicago. That was the worst that historians documented. And the perspectives on this violence ranged from shock, from some that were not necessarily paying attention to some of the race-related issues leading into the World War I era. And when they opened up their papers and saw this, they thought, what's happening, right? And also to compassion from those who, A, might have been firsthand victims of racism and Jim Crow and de facto segregation themselves, or those who believed that Black men returning from duty deserved equal treatment under the law, and those who just generally observed the continuation of segregation despite all of the Reconstruction-related amendments. Okay, so hopefully this video discussed these questions and gives you a better sense of what the world is looking like as World War I comes to a close. We'll pick up with the 20s soon. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.